On April 27, 2000, André D.D. Desjardins was shot dead outside a restaurant in Montreal. He was struck 11 times in what police described as a professional killing. The case drew national attention, not only because of the manner of the attack, but because Desjardins was a well-known figure in Quebec's criminal and labor history. He had once been one of the most powerful men in the province's construction world, a union leader and power broker whose name had long been associated with corruption and organized crime. By the time of his death, Desjardins belonged to a later chapter in Quebec's underworld. His career, however, also pointed back to an earlier chapter, one that intersected with the 1976 Montreal Olympics. The path from that murder leads back to the Olympic construction system and, from there, to a broader story about political ambition, administrative failure, criminal influence, and one of the most expensive Olympic disasters on record. At the center of the early story stood Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau. Drapeau had already transformed Montreal's international profile through Expo 67, the World's Fair that drew more than 50 million visitors and permanently altered the city's image. After that success, he concluded that Montreal could and should pursue another major international event. In his view, if the city could host Expo, it could also host the Olympics. The idea itself was not unreasonable. The problem was the way it was pursued. Montreal first failed in its bid for the 1972 Summer Games, then returned for the 1976 contest. At the 69th IOC session in Amsterdam on May 12, 1970, Montreal defeated both Los Angeles and Moscow. Los Angeles was eliminated after the first round, and Montreal won the decisive vote against Moscow. For Drapeau, the result confirmed his belief that Montreal belonged among the world's major cities. For Canada, it marked the first successful bid to host a Summer Olympics. Drapeau presented the Games to the public not as a high-risk public undertaking, but as a self-sustaining project that would generate enough revenue to cover its costs. He became widely known for saying that the Olympics could no more run a deficit than a man could have a baby. The line was memorable and politically useful. It also established a standard of confidence that the project could not possibly meet. To understand why that promise sounded plausible to some people, it is necessary to consider the Olympic movement of the period. The Games were still shaped by the influence of Avery Brundage, the former IOC president who defended strict amateurism and resisted commercialization. Brundage regarded the Olympics as a civic and cultural institution that should be protected from overt commercial intrusion. Although that view was already becoming outdated, it still influenced how Olympic organizers spoke about the Games. It helped sustain the impression that the Olympics were primarily a noble international festival rather than a massive financial and logistical enterprise. Drapeau used that atmosphere to Montreal's advantage. He did not present the city as the wealthiest candidate. Instead, he presented it as the more principled one, a city capable of staging an Olympics without reducing it to commercial spectacle. In a Cold War contest that also included Moscow and Los Angeles, Montreal benefited from appearing comparatively neutral. That helped it win the bid. It did nothing to solve the problem of how the Games would actually be financed and managed. From the start, the promise of self-sufficiency alarmed officials who understood how quickly Olympic costs could rise. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's government refused to allow the federal government to become the automatic guarantor of an uncontrolled deficit. Ottawa wanted explicit assurances that it would not be left paying for a failed municipal project. This placed the Montreal Olympics inside a difficult political structure. The city wanted prestige, Quebec watched with growing caution, and the federal government wanted distance. That arrangement exposed a deeper weakness. The city had secured the right to host the Games, but it had not built the institutional machinery required to stage them. Hosting the Olympics required an organization capable of coordinating finance, construction, logistics, diplomacy, security, and international relations over several years. Montreal did not yet have that kind of disciplined system. It had a mayor of exceptional confidence, a powerful civic narrative, and an increasingly fragile assumption that the details would eventually fall into place. That weakness became clearer when Roger Rousseau entered the project. Rousseau, a senior Canadian diplomat, was appointed to head the Montreal Olympic Organizing Committee. He brought experience, administrative seriousness, and international credibility. In principle, he was exactly the kind of figure the project needed. In practice, his presence made it easier to see how much of the project remained undefined and how little discipline had been imposed on the municipal side. Rousseau and Drapeau represented different approaches to the Games. Rousseau treated them as a complex operational system requiring careful coordination and strict control. Drapeau treated them as an extension of mayoral ambition and civic symbolism. That division became more serious as financial pressures increased. The assumption that Montreal could glide through the Games on a combination of civic pride, television revenue, and public enthusiasm began to erode almost immediately. In September 1972, the Munich Olympics were transformed by the massacre of Israeli athletes by Black September militants. The event permanently changed the security expectations attached to future Olympic Games. For Montreal, it meant that security would now become a much larger and more expensive part of the budget. A project that had already been sold as manageable now faced a significantly darker and more demanding reality. That would have required any host city to revise its assumptions. Montreal instead continued to move toward a more ambitious and more expensive vision. The single most important decision in that process was the decision to turn the Olympic Stadium into a monument. Drapeau did not want only a venue for the Games. He wanted a lasting civic landmark and a domed multi-use facility that could also serve Montreal's baseball ambitions after the Olympics. Major League Baseball had arrived in the city in 1969 with the Expos, and Drapeau hoped the Olympic complex would help anchor Montreal's future as a North American sports center. At that point, the project ceased to be a practical Olympic construction program and became an attempt to secure a civic legacy through architecture. The architect chosen for that task was Roger Taillibert, the French designer behind the Parc des Princes in Paris. Taillibert specialized in sculptural, technically ambitious concrete forms. If the objective had been to create an iconic structure, he was a logical choice. If the objective had been to deliver a fast, controlled, low-risk public project, he was a much more dangerous one. Montreal needed manageability. What it selected was monumental design. The result was a visually remarkable concept, an asymmetrical stadium with a tower and a retractable roof system, surrounded by architecturally distinctive auxiliary facilities. The structure would later become famous for two nicknames, the Big O, reflecting its form, and the Big O, reflecting its cost. The design promised international distinction. It also guaranteed technical difficulty. Once construction began, almost every source of risk materialized. The site itself posed serious engineering challenges. Montreal's subsurface conditions were poorly suited to the load patterns implied by the design, which demanded extensive foundation work. Construction began in 1973, but the combination of technical complexity, inflation, labor conflict, weak oversight, and political impatience quickly made deadlines unrealistic. The city had approved something difficult to price, difficult to build, and almost impossible to control once slippage began. Administrative weakness compounded those problems. Gérard Niding, Drapeau's close ally and chairman of Montreal's executive committee, later became one of the central figures in the corruption scandal surrounding the Games. A subsequent inquiry led by Justice Albert Malouf exposed extensive wrongdoing in Olympic contracting. Niding was later convicted of breach of trust for accepting a bribe linked to untendered construction contracts. He received a one-day jail sentence and a large fine, a punishment far smaller than the scale of the dysfunction associated with the project. The labor environment was equally compromised. Quebec's construction industry was already deeply affected by corruption and organized crime. André Desjardins had risen to prominence as a union leader and power broker in precisely that system. He became known as the King of Construction, and his activities were serious enough to help prompt the Cliché Commission, which documented corruption in Quebec construction unions and their links to the mafia. The Olympic project was therefore not simply a municipal construction program that went wrong. It was a massive public works project inserted into an already compromised industrial and political environment. That fact changed the character of the disaster. The Olympics were no longer being built solely through ordinary public administration. They were being built inside a system shaped by intimidation, patronage, weak controls, labor disruption, and criminal leverage. Inflation drove up costs. Labor conflict repeatedly slowed progress. Corruption distorted contracting. The design itself required custom solutions. At the same time, the schedule remained fixed. Unlike a bridge or ordinary municipal building, an Olympic Games cannot open late. The world arrives on the appointed date whether the host city is ready or not. By 1975, it had become increasingly clear that Montreal could not control the project on its own. Quebec moved closer to direct intervention. Premier Robert Bourassa's government had obvious reasons to hesitate, but the problem had become too large to remain a municipal matter. If Montreal failed, the humiliation would not remain local. Quebec ultimately stepped in and assigned Claude Rouleau to help stabilize the project. Even Rouleau, who was meant to restore order, would later face corruption allegations of his own. That detail reinforced the extent to which the construction environment had already been compromised. Once the province assumed a larger role, the purpose of the project changed. The aim was no longer to complete Tailbert's full vision in time for the Games. The aim was to make the Olympics possible. Large elements of the original design were postponed, simplified, or abandoned for the immediate deadline. The tower and retractable roof were not completed for the 1976 Olympics. Construction on those features continued long after the Games ended, and the Kevlar roof was not installed until 1987, a decade later, using components that had sat in storage while Montreal lived with the unfinished remains of its official showpiece. The opening itself reflected that compromise. The Games opened on July 17, 1976, and ran through August 1, but the stadium opened in unfinished form. Workers were still clearing debris in the final stretch before the ceremony. Thousands of laborers had been working around the clock simply to make the event possible. What Montreal presented to the world was not the complete architectural vision it had promised. It was an emergency version sufficient to stage the ceremonies and competitions. The fact that the Games took place at all has often softened the memory of the disaster. That is misleading. A mega-event can succeed as spectacle and fail as governance at the same time. Montreal 1976 did exactly that. The Games produced major athletic moments, including Nadia Comaneci's perfect scores, while also leaving behind a financial and administrative breakdown. Those outcomes were not contradictory. They were inseparable. The event itself was also marked by boycott. Nearly 30 countries, most of them African, withdrew after the IOC refused to ban New Zealand over its rugby ties to apartheid South Africa. Montreal had wanted to host a universal celebration. Instead, it staged a compromised Games in an unfinished stadium under conditions of political fracture and mounting debt. The financial reckoning made the larger failure undeniable. Official IOC retrospective figures place Montreal 1976 at roughly $606 million Canadian dollars in revenue, $383 million Canadian dollars in operating expenses, and $1.21 billion Canadian dollars in capital expenditure. The core problem was not the narrow operating cost of running the event. It was the cost of construction and physical infrastructure. Once debt service, repairs, and related expenditures were fully counted, the broader bill associated with the Olympic complex rose to about $1.6 billion Canadian dollars before it was finally paid off in 2006. Quebec relied heavily on a special tobacco tax to eliminate the debt. That is why Montreal remains such an important reference point in Olympic history. The city did not merely overspend. It redefined what an Olympic financial failure could look like. This was no longer a case of an expensive festival. It became a 30-year public burden attached to an event that lasted only 15 days. The easiest way to reduce the story is to make it a lesson about one foolish promise. Drapeau said the Games would not run a deficit, and they did. That statement is true, but it misses the scale of the failure. The deeper problem was structural. Montreal 1976 was the result of prestige politics colliding with modern project complexity before the institutions around it were capable of managing the collision. The organizational structure was weak, the design was overambitious, the oversight was poor, the contracting environment was corruptible, and the political incentives rewarded public confidence more than operational realism. This helps explain why so many different actors in the story could each appear justified in isolation while still driving the project toward disaster. Drapeau genuinely believed the games would elevate the city. Taillibert genuinely knew how to create distinctive architecture. Rousseau genuinely understood the need for international administrative discipline. Quebec genuinely intervened in order to prevent a larger failure. The problem was not that every participant was acting in bad faith. It was that no one imposed reality on the project early enough or forcefully enough. Reality, in a project like this, arrives as arithmetic. That is why the most surprising fact about Montreal is not that the games failed financially. It is that they opened at all before the entire structure of the project collapsed. The aftermath remained politically ambiguous. Drapeau was not immediately destroyed by the fiasco. He remained mayor until 1986. Montrealers did not regard him as a simple villain. He had also delivered Expo 67, and for many people he represented an era in which the city imagined itself at the largest possible scale. The Olympics, however disastrous, were still part of that same mythology. Political failure does not always erase political legend. Sometimes it is absorbed into it. The stadium continued the argument long after the debt had begun. The roof, once finally installed in 1987, proved unreliable. It tore, leaked, and required repeated intervention. The baseball future that had helped justify the building never transformed the city in the way Drapeau had hoped. The Montreal Expos used the stadium, but it never became the ideal multi-use civic engine imagined at the beginning. Over time, the structure became a permanent compromise, too famous to ignore, too expensive to celebrate easily, too costly to demolish, and too flawed to serve as a true vindication of the project. That is what a white elephant becomes in practice. It is not a useless building in the strict sense. It is a building that continues to demand maintenance, money, and explanation long after it has disproved the dream that produced it. The debt itself was not fully retired until 2006, 30 years after the Games. By then, that fact had become part of the stadium's mythology. A global event that lasted 15 days had imposed a burden that lasted a generation. Montreal thereby became a permanent warning in Olympic discourse. Later host cities were measured against the possibility of becoming another Montreal. That phrase exists because Montreal created a lasting category of Olympic skepticism. This is also why André Desjardins matters at the beginning of the story. When he was murdered in 2000, the killing belonged to a later cycle of underworld violence in Quebec. But Desjardins himself came from the older construction system that had already fused unions, corruption, organized crime, and public contracts into one of the province's ugliest political realities. He did not single-handedly bankrupt the Olympics. The story is too large for that. But his career illustrates that the Montreal Olympics were never only a design failure or a budgeting failure. They unfolded inside a compromised environment populated by identifiable men with real leverage over labor, contracting, and intimidation. Without that dimension, the Olympic disaster risks sounding abstract: overruns, deficits, deadlines, procurement, and tax burdens. With it, the story becomes grounded in power. It becomes a story about real coercion, real corruption, and real people who profited while governments lost control. That is what makes Montreal 1976 darker than the standard account of an over-budget sporting event. It was not simply a case of optimistic estimates followed by bad luck. It was the collision of civic vanity with system failure inside a city whose construction culture was already compromised. The result was more than a debt. It was a lasting civic wound. Montreal still lives with the architecture, the memory, and the irony embodied in the names Big O and Big O. It still lives with the fact that one of the most ambitious urban spectacles in Canadian history ended not in triumph, but in prolonged cleanup, financial cleanup, legal cleanup, political cleanup, and moral cleanup. The clearest meaning of the story is not that Montreal dreamed too big. Cities often need leaders willing to imagine more than the present allows. The failure was that Montreal mistook imagination for management. It treated symbolism as if it could outrun arithmetic. It treated charisma as if it could substitute for process. It assumed that a monument could be conceived first and governed later. When those assumptions finally collided with contracts, labor conflict, corruption, inflation, and time, the city learned a lesson the Olympics have repeated ever since. A global spectacle can conceal a broken system for a while, but it cannot repair one. By the time André Desjardins was killed in 2000, the Olympic flame had been extinguished for nearly a quarter of a century. The debt still existed. The stadium still stood. The old construction world was still producing violence. That may be the most revealing conclusion of all. The games were sold as 15 days of glory. What Montreal actually hosted was a much longer event, a 30-year struggle over power, prestige, and the price a city pays when ambition outruns control.